The morning after he announced a UK general election for the 4th of July, the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was interviewed on the BBC's Radio 4 Today programme.
The Prime Minister joins us now from the first stop of his election tour in Derbyshire, where I'm glad to say he is in the warm and dry. Prime Minister, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Yes.
His Conservative Party's policies to reduce immigration were top of the agenda.
My record is clear. We did get the numbers down last year and we've made good progress, but I've got a clear plan.
In particular, a plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda.
Will anybody get on a plane to go to Rwanda before the election?
The flights will go in July, and that's a choice at this election.
After the election.
If you believe in stopping the boats. Yes, if you believe in stopping the boats.
It's been a tumultuous and controversial policy, met with numerous and ongoing legal hurdles. Sunak put it starkly. He said that flights to Rwanda would only take off if he is re-elected to 10 Downing Street in July.
But the election is about a choice, Nick, about the future. So if you think stopping the boats is important, and if you think, like I do, that you need a deterrent to do that...
He also boasted that across Europe, other EU leaders are looking closely at the Rwanda plan.
Now, 15 other European countries just the other week agreed with that approach.
In this episode, two experts in UK immigration policy explain how the Rwanda plan became such a crucial part of the immigration debate in the UK, and whatever happens in the election, how it's already shifting the wider conversation in Europe about how to deal with migrants and asylum seekers. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. I'm joined, first of all, by Avery Anapol, one of the politics editors in The Conversation UK. Hey, Avery.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Avery, I don't think it'll be a surprise to people listening that you're not originally from the UK, although that's where you currently live, right?
That's right. I'm originally from Midwest US, and I moved to the UK about 5 years ago, just before the pandemic.
Before the pandemic. So what's it been like being a migrant to the UK?
So I've been on 2 different visas since I moved here, first as a student and now as a spouse of a British citizen. So I've been through the Home Office application process many, many times. And I'm always just struck by how difficult and time-consuming it is, even for someone who's university educated, speaks English as a first language, which of course not everyone here is. But I think what's probably the hardest bit is just being really hyper aware of how my legal status, my job, my right to use the NHS is all tied to my partner's salary and really at the whim of the Home Office or any political changes. So that can be quite stressful. And even with all of that, I don't get to vote in the upcoming election until and if I become a citizen.
So it's really tricky. There's a minefield to navigate for any migrant to the UK. And although you can't vote, you are one of the politics editors here at The Conversation in the UK. And this topic of immigration is one of the central issues of the campaign of the general election that's been called for the 4th of July and which you're covering as part of the politics team. So tell me what the main political parties are actually saying about immigration.
Yeah, so as you said, it's a really important issue, both looking at legal migration and irregular migration. So that's when we hear about politicians talking about small boat crossings or illegal migration. The Conservatives who are currently in government have said they want to get net migration down. They want to cut it in half, but want to set a new target every year that will be voted on by Parliament. They also talk a lot about stopping the boats and using this Rwanda scheme, which we'll talk about a bit later, as a deterrent to stop people from wanting to make the journey across the Channel. Labour, who we're expecting, due to polling, to get into government on July 4th, wants to also get net migration down, but they, unlike the Conservatives, are refusing to set a firm target. I think they've learned from sort of the past 14 years of that not really working as a tool. They've also put a lot more emphasis on upskilling workers in the UK to stop the need for recruiting international workers. And then as far as irregular migration, they've spoken about border security, cracking down on smuggling gangs, and just improving the security system and cooperation with Europe. And then Reform UK, which is on really the further right side of the political spectrum, is very anti-immigration. That's led by Nigel Farage. And he wants to have zero net migration, so basically a one in, one out policy.
And this is the first general election to happen since the UK actually left the European Union in January 2020. Immigration was a really big part of why British people voted for Brexit. How has the immigration regime in the UK actually changed since Brexit?
So the biggest change with Brexit was the end of free movement, which meant that people living in the EU could not then just come and work in the UK and vice versa. That, of course, led to a lot of labor shortages. So lots of people working in different sectors, including care sector, hospitality sector, were no longer coming to the UK to work. So under Boris Johnson, the Conservatives actually introduced some more liberal migration policies. So introducing what's called a points-based system, introducing some new types of visas for skilled workers, allowing people to stay on, if they were students, to stay in the UK and work after their studies, and also a new visa for care workers. What happened, of course, was that a lot of people came to the UK, and that net migration number reached record highs in 2022, mostly due to increases in work and study.
Yeah, and what about irregular migration and this fixation on the people who are making this very dangerous crossing across the channel in small boats?
Yeah, you're right. So a lot of the most divisive conversation has been about these small boat crossings, groups of people coming up on shore in Dover in these really treacherous situations. It's a tiny fraction of overall migration, but I think it's a really powerful political tool. And the Conservative government in the last few years has passed a few laws that essentially criminalized claiming asylum in the UK if you enter irregularly, and then threatened to send people either back to their home country or to a third country, in this case, Rwanda. This plan has just been massively held up by courts, and now they're sort of using this as a promise to voters. So vote for the Conservatives and the Rwanda flights will finally get off the ground.
And I know you've been working with a number of experts over the last few years to cover this big immigration debate in the UK. And two of them are Michaela Benson and Nando Sigona. What do we need to know about these two experts?
So Michaela and Nando are some of our go-to researchers working on asylum policy and migration. Nando Sigona is the professor of international migration and forced displacement at the University of Birmingham. And Michaela Benson is a professor in public sociology at Lancaster University. And they also are podcast hosts, so they host a podcast on immigration in post-Brexit Britain called Who Do We Think We Are?
Thank you so much, Avery. We'll let you get back to poring over those manifestos. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Gemma.
I wanted to start with what's going on in the UK right now. So we're in a general election period, and a big focus of this election is immigration. And at the forefront of the Conservative government in power in their plan is this plan to send people, asylum seekers, to Rwanda. What's been the genesis of this Rwanda plan?
It's maybe not particularly new for Britain. This is a country that used to send convicts to Australia or, in general, unwanted population to farthest away they could afford to during the period of the empire. There is something else there, and where there is this link with the empire is this idea that is a way of demonstrating how the country is repositioning itself after the Brexit, after leaving the European Union. But what is more important to highlight is why we got this problem in the first place. One thing we should remember is that at the time in which many countries in the south of Europe, in the middle of 2016, the time of the refugee crisis, some countries like Greece or Italy were receiving hundreds of thousands of people.
More than 1 million refugees and migrants have entered Europe in 2015, fleeing the war in Syria and other conflict zones.
At that point, Britain really received a handful of migrants through irregular crossing. Actually, irregular crossing was not even an issue at all. This emerged as an issue only after Brexit, and in particular at the time of the pandemic. So in many ways, they are trying to solve with the Rwanda plan a problem that they have created with Brexit.
I think that there's another dimension to Brexit that people perhaps don't necessarily associate with migration, and that is to do with the negotiation of trade deals following Brexit. The Rwanda plan, the deportation plan, is actually part of a trade and development agreement with Rwanda. So it's very much caught up in negotiations led by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office about repositioning Britain on the world stage after Brexit in a context where it has to basically renegotiate all its trading partnerships.
According to the UK's National Audit Office, Rwanda is getting £370 million in development funding from the deal, plus an extra £120 million once 300 people are relocated to Rwanda. The UK will give Rwanda another £20,000 of development funding for each person relocated, and that's on top of £150,000 per person to cover accommodation, food, education, alongside other operational costs.
And what's the rationale behind it? Because essentially, people who are coming to the UK to claim asylum will be sent, theoretically, to Rwanda.
So do you want an answer besides is pure racism? There is an underlying narrative says that Rwanda is such a bad place that people will not want to come to Britain anymore. So this is like the deterrence argument. We have a plan to send people to Rwanda that will be enough to stop people crossing irregularly because they know they are not going to be able to stay here. But also at the time in which Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary, launched the plan, that was April 2022, we also have the periodic meeting of the head of states of the Commonwealth happening actually in Rwanda. So we have, in a sense, almost an exchange. You help us with migration, we give you visibility, we give you political capital, and this is very strongly interconnected.
The plan is linked to the Illegal Immigration Act 2023, which means that anybody who entered the UK illegally, say via a small boat crossing the channel between France and the UK, that after, I think it was the 20th of July 2023, anyone who does that won't have their asylum claim looked at and will be subject to removal. Is it mainly these people who are at risk of being sent to Rwanda?
So I think there are a couple of things there that it's worth just laying out, which is, of course, the framing of this as illegal is a framing that's authorised by the government. And actually, probably it's more appropriate to refer to people crossing the channel as unauthorised. But I think that beyond the question of who actually falls into the scope of this particular measure, it's very clear that we've seen more generally over the course of the Conservative-led administration of the UK since 2010, rising fears among those communities where there are large numbers of people who've newly arrived in the UK, or even long-standing communities of people who've migrated to the UK, about the terms on which they will be able to stay put. So if we think back to Theresa May, when she was in charge of the Home Office.
We want to ensure that only legal migrants have access to the labour market, free health services, housing, bank accounts and driving licences. And this is not just about making the UK a more hostile place for illegal migrants.
She brought in this suite of policies called the hostile environment, she called them that herself, to communicate to the world that the UK was tough on immigration. And that seems to have generated quite a significant affect within these communities where people are really frightened about what their future is. So whether they fall into the scope of that agreement or not, there's always a fear that people's status and right to be in this country could change on the head of a pin.
UN Refugee Agency says in a new statement, people fleeing war, conflict, and persecution deserve compassion and empathy. They should not be traded like commodities and transferred abroad for processing.
This Rwanda plan has caused a lot of consternation, a lot of been stories written about it, lots of criticism of it at an international level and from other countries. What are the main legal and ethical concerns that critics are raising about the plan, particularly in relation to international asylum laws and human rights?
One is, as you pointed out, the legal challenges, both in terms of international legal obligation, but also national law that we've seen going through different courts, and we have found to some extent holding, in particular, the concern about the risk human rights violation in Rwanda and what risk the asylum seekers would be subject to if they were deported, particularly if they belong to specific minority. We have seen that the cost per person being sent to Rwanda is extortionate. And the other issue is that the feasibility. There is a big difference between what the British government is promised to do through the Rwanda plan and what actually the reality is if they were able to implement. Because at some point we heard that there were thousands, tens of thousands of people being sent to Rwanda because they wanted to basically send everyone who was coming irregularly. On the other end, we have heard from Rwanda that at most they could only host a few hundred people at a time. What happens if someone is recognized as a refugee, or even if he's refused stay in Rwanda? Rwanda, will it be able to detain them, or will it be able to block them from leaving the country? So the point with this plan was that it was unfeasible from the beginning, and to some extent was meant to have a more symbolic effect. You could argue, if you were cynical, that the government never wanted to implement, but they wanted it to have it in the news to have that deterrence effect.
Since the Rwanda plan was first announced in 2022, it's been met with a myriad of legal hurdles preventing flights from taking off. In November 2023, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the plan was unlawful because Rwanda was not deemed a safe country to send asylum seekers. In response, the UK government introduced a new law, which was ratified after much political wrangling in April this year, that declared Rwanda was a safe country for asylum seekers. So, Nando, the UK isn't the only country that's tried something like this. Australia is often pointed to as an example because it has processed asylum seekers offshore on the islands of Nauru and Papua New Guinea. If the Rwanda plan does come in, how does it compare to what other countries have done in the past?
There are two actually countries that are interesting for here. One is Australia, the other one is Israel. Israel because they implemented a very similar scheme with Rwanda, and it backfired very strongly with public opinion in Israel. The Australian approach has developed over time. In the first stage, when they start to work with the Papua New Guineas and Nauru, Australian officers were basically assessing asylum claims on the island, and then in case people were found with a genuine case for protection, they were basically allowed to move into Australia. In a later stage, instead, they adopted a very similar approach than one that the British government is proposing, where basically even if you are recognized as a refugee, you will not allowed to resettle in Australia. One problem that Australia faced is that the capacity that Papua New Guinea was offering for receiving asylum seekers was not sufficient for the number of people that were meant to be sent from Australia. So if you want to use a deterrence tool, and everyone knows that you only have 500 places available and there are 10,000 people that should be removed, immediately the deterrence is completely lost.
Are there any other routes that people could take to get to the UK other than these unauthorised routes, safe routes to get to the UK?
What we've been seeing since Brexit is a kind of expansion of something that the government is calling safe and legal routes. And it includes, notably, the schemes that have been launched for the people of Hong Kong and for the people of Ukraine.
UK opens a special new visa program for Hong Kongers. Those who hold a British National Overseas or BNO passport are now eligible for a 5-year UK
Unlike previous schemes,
permit.
Ukrainians do not need to have any links to the UK, and there will be no limit on the number who can come here.
More than 257,000 Ukrainians and 201,000 people from Hong Kong have been able to enter the UK as part of these schemes.
Also, there is a scheme for Syrians and for the Afghani. What is interesting that while they are presented as part of this safe and legal routes, in reality, if you just need to look at the number, you will see that the scheme are extremely hard to access.
Around 20,000 Syrians were deemed eligible for resettlement in the UK between 2014 and 2020, and just under 30,000 Afghans since 2021.
What about the rest? What about all the rest of the world? Is that basically, in principle, if they are allowed to enter the UK legally, they may be able to apply for asylum. The problem is that visa requirements from all the top refugee-sending countries in the world are so stringent that it's practically impossible to reach the country.
Just to spell that out, like if you're Iraqi or if you're Iranian and you want to come to the UK to claim asylum, which you're entitled to do under international law, if you weren't going to take an unauthorised route, you'd have to take a flight or a train, the Eurostar, have a ticket, and then have a visa in order to get on that flight or that train. And then you could claim asylum when you got here. That's essentially what you're saying. That's the only authorised route. Is that right?
Correct. And what is interesting, you just need to look at the main nationality of people crossing the channel. And it's actually from those countries we're talking about. We are talking about Iranian, Iraqi. At the moment, there are also Syrians, a quite significant number, and also Afghan.
One of the things that's really central to the immigration debate at the moment in the UK is the number of people making a very dangerous crossing of the English Channel from France to the UK in small inflatable dinghies with the help of people smugglers. I was just looking at some numbers, and between March 2023 and March this year, just over 38,000 people came irregularly to the UK, and 81% of them made the journey across the Channel in a small boat. So it's very worrying and it's got a lot of political attention. This is quite a new phenomenon, people making this crossing. So when did it start happening and why did it start happening?
The small boats are a Brexit-made policy failure. There were several things that came together at that point to produce that, some of which is exactly to do with relationships with the EU and particularly with France and the control of that strip of water. And then it's become almost common sense that the change in the relationship between the UK and the EU, specifically the UK's removal from the EU border regime, has been significant in increasing the number of crossings.
Why is the change in the border regime significant in the number of crossings?
The main one would be the Dublin regulation, the principle that the first country of entry within the European Union is one responsible for assessing an asylum claim. So this is the principle that have always been protecting the UK, but also the northern European states from the arrival from the Middle East and the Mediterranean. In general, that mechanism of what's called burden sharing in the European Union was, in a sense, protecting the British border, was also making much more easily for Britain to send people back to France or to the other countries in the European Union where they stayed. What is happening now with the change in the border regime after Brexit means that mechanism are no longer in place. And the people, but also the smuggler, are well aware that it's much more difficult for Britain at the moment to remove people to the European Union or elsewhere.
The Leave campaign want to take back control, which it claims has been lost as a member of the European Union.
359. This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
I know the two of you have been working a lot on the narrative around immigration that the UK has been trying to push forward post-Brexit. The pledge, the Leave campaign made in that campaign back in 2016 to take back control of the UK's borders. It was a big part of the referendum campaign. What has actually happened? Has Britain been able to regulate the flow of migration in that period?
It depends how we understand take back control. We have seen greater regulation around immigration and greater picking and choosing of who can come and on what terms, which of course is made possible by the UK withdrawing from that free movement arrangement with the European Union. And what that has done in respect to migration flows to the UK is it's actually fundamentally changed who's coming to the UK, as well as the terms on which they're able to come. For example, we're now seeing, if we look at the top nationality of people coming to the UK since Brexit, in every single visa category, except for the safe and legal routes, it's Indian nationals by a long way. And I think the fact that very early on in post-Brexit, the UK signed a memorandum of understanding with India, which included some ideas about mobility between the two countries. We've also seen the number of EU citizens coming to the UK massively drop, as well as large numbers of EU citizens who were formerly free movers leaving the UK. And this is creating demographic changes when we look at who's coming. Broadly, I would say we are seeing a revival of some of those relationships with the Commonwealth. I don't think it's accidental that the first safe and legal route that was offered after Brexit was to the Hong Kongers, the citizens of the UK's so-called last colony. So I think we are seeing a kind of a reorientation that aligns with agendas that relate to foreign relations in a context where their primary trading partner is no longer the European Union.
Okay, so the Labour Party is widely expected to win the election. And while its leader, Keir Starmer, has said that he hasn't ruled out offshore processing of asylum claims, he has said that he will scrap the Rwanda plan. And yet it's an idea that's gaining traction elsewhere in Europe. Now, we should say that there are already EU migration pacts with a number of countries in North Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, that are meant to curb migration to Europe in return for aid. These have been really heavily criticised for human rights violations and violence. But now, some leaders, including the EU President Ursula von der Leyen, have suggested that they're open to more similar style Rwanda deals with sending asylum seekers to be processed in a third country. What's actually happening on this in the EU?
The one with North Africa very much attempt to lock people in the so-called transit countries so that they don't cross the sea, and that have been challenged several times in court as a breach of international laws in terms of the human rights of the migrants. There's been a number of countries that have been following very closely the legal challenges to the Rwanda plan, and also the way that the British had approached it. I mean, like in particular Denmark, but also we know that Germany has looked at it, and Italy in particular. One of the countries where the European Union, in particular Italy, has been building a stronger relationship is Albania. In a sense, Italy has managed to do what Rishi Sunak wanted to do, which was to find another country where he could send people back easily, or even as a third country. But it was not possible to negotiate a similar deal, but Italy manages.
Italy recently entered into a controversial agreement with Albania. Albania will host up to 36,000 migrants for a year.
The deal between Italy and Albania was announced in November 2023. Under it, Italy will set up 2 detention centres in Albania where people trying to reach Italy by sea will have their asylum claims processed. From there, they'll either be transported to Italy if they're successful or deported back to their home country.
Countries like Austria have been negotiating with Kosovo recently, and they were in the news as wanting to pilot this, but also Denmark, again, as buying a sort of prison places for immigrants in their country.
When the Rwanda plan was first floated in 2022, it was largely derided by European leaders and member states in the European Union. So why has there been a change of stance towards it? Or at least to do something similar?
The political wind in Europe has clearly gone much more towards anti-immigration sentiments. We've seen a right-wing party, particularly on anti-immigration agenda, gaining more and more support. It's an interesting shift.
In European elections in June, France and Germany experienced a growth in support for far-right parties, while elsewhere, centre-right parties held their ground and maintained their majority in the European Parliament.
During the pandemic, there was a better sort of attitude vis-à-vis migrants, particularly because they were recognized as playing a key and essential role as key workers and helping us to go through the pandemic. But since then, we have seen increasingly a more securitarian narrative emerging, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Germany, etc. In fact, Ursula von der Leyen is an example of a center-right politician embracing more and more the right-wing agenda on immigration, getting much closer to, for example, to Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, around this issue. They traveled together to African states in Northern Africa to negotiate a deal for the EU. Doesn't matter it didn't work or it may potentially not work, but really help them to get the control of the narrative of migration, which is what a lot of the right-wing parties in Europe want and try to do.
I think what we're seeing across Western Europe and some other liberal democracies is really that mainstreaming of anti-migrant sentiment. And so those things that, a few years ago, as you described, Gemma, would have been completely off the cards and derided, have now become almost common sense. And I think that's a tendency that we need to look closely at and which should be alarming, I think.
And I guess that takes me to my final point, which is really standing back from all of this technicalities about what legal plans might get through or not. If this is the direction of travel in a number of the world's richest countries in Europe, what does this mean for people, asylum seekers, people just looking for safe haven from war and from other challenges that they're facing?
I think that it's very clear that as the borders become strengthened against people coming in, that there are going to be fewer and fewer places for people to go. People are going to be taking ever more treacherous and dangerous journeys in order to reach the places they hope that they can get to. I think that it's not a surprise that we're seeing this at a time when governments are starting to wake up to the fact that there are some issues on the horizon that could produce mass displacement on a new scale. And that's obviously the conflicts that we're seeing around the world, but also the potential of climate-driven migration. What does that mean for people whose homes are no longer safe for them to live in because they've been destroyed by that kind of climate devastation?
More resources from Western states are going to go in, try to anchor them, in some cases using military force, creating close camps and using technology as a way of enforcing them to stay. Warehousing of people in huge camps, basically parking them for a very extensive period of time. I mean, while we always talk within Western liberal democracies about this fear of invasion by people seeking asylum, refuge, the reality is, as the UN High Commission for Refugees has been pointing out for years, that the large majority of those seeking international protection stay in the region. In other cases, as we have seen, for example, with measures put in place for anchoring Syrian refugees to Turkey or Jordan, by trying to put pressure on Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon to give people citizenship or give them working rights. So try to basically create the condition that would enable people to stay in those countries rather than try to further movement. But as Michaela was pointing out, I think climate and environmental reasons are going to play a more and more significant role. And we're already seeing it in place. People will try to look for migration as a solution. Migration for many people is a solution, is a way of adapting to the climate change transformation, and that this is not going to change.
Thanks both very much to the two of you for helping shed some light on what might be to come. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you to Avery Anapol, who you heard at the top of this episode. We'll put some links in our show notes to some of our wider UK general election coverage. If you want to hear more from Nando and Michaela about their research, do go and subscribe to their podcast, Who Do We Think We Are? We'll pop a link in our show notes to that too. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani with production assistance by Katie Flood. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Khan is our global executive editor, and Soraya Nandi helps with our transcripts. I'm Gemma Ware, the show's host and executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.